Day, and welcome to the 47th episode of the podcast series Decolonizing the Mind. This episode will deal with the rise of the extreme right in Europe and in the world, and in fact also outside of the global north. You see that also coming in the global south. Now, I'm giving a DTM analysis of the rise of the extreme right. So it's important to understand the basics of DTM, which is a theoretical framework that's an alternative to the knowledge production of the European Enlightenment. And it consists of three elements: a critique of the Enlightenment, an alternative, and the translation of that alternative into practical policies. So let's define what is now the extreme right. In the liberal view, the extreme right is that political school that's a threat to individual freedom and of which xenophobia is part of it. For the Marxists, it is the far right is fascism. Fascism is an extreme expression of class oppression. But for DTM, the far right is an expression of a colonial civilization that is extremist. The difference between moderate and extreme is gradual, it's not essential. And I'll explain that. So if we want to understand the extreme right, obviously we have to understand Nazism, which is the expression of extreme right both in liberalism and Marxism. Now, in my DTM view of Nazism, I regard Nazism as a failed form of colonialism. And to understand that, you have to look at how Hitler looked at Nazism. For Hitler, Nazism was basically colonialism. He saw British colonialism as his example of what he would like to do in Eastern Europe. He says, what India was for England, the territories of Russia will be for us. It should be possible for us to control this region to the east with 250,000 men plus a cadre of good administrators. Let's learn from the English, who, with 250,000 men in all, including 50,000 soldiers, governed 400 million Indians. This space in Russia must always be dominated by Germans. The Russian space is our India. Like the English, we shall rule this empire with a handful of men. The wealth of Great Britain is the result less of a perfect commercial organization than of the capitalist exploitation of 350 million Indian slaves. So you won't get this in Eurocentric narratives of fascism, neither in liberalism nor in Marxism. Nazism, if you look at it, is also a failed form of Zionism, because if you see what Zionism are doing in Palestine now, is what Hitler envisioned he would do in Eastern Europe. And Hitler says the German colonists ought to live on handsome, spacious farms, which is basically the settlements in Palestine, the Zionist settlements in Palestine. The German services will be lodged in marvelous buildings, the governors in palaces. Beneath the shelter of the administrative services, we shall gradually organize all that is indispensable to the maintenance of a certain standard of living. Around the city, to a depth of 30 to 40 kilometers, we shall have a belt of handsome villages connected by the best roads, as is now the case with the settlements. What exists beyond that will be another world in which we mean to let the Russians live as they like Gaza now. It is merely necessary that we should rule them. In the event of a revolution, we shall only have to drop a few bombs on their cities and the affair will be liquidated. It is as if talking about Palestine and Gaza now. Now compare fascism to colonialism. Fascism and World War II lasted 5 years, with a number of victims in Europe of 28 million, of which 25 million were in the Soviet Union. Half of the 6 million Jews from the Holocaust were from Eastern Europe, not Western Europe. Poland and Ukraine And if you compare fascism and colonialism in terms of the number of victims, you could ask yourself what was more extreme, fascism or colonialism. Look at the crimes against humanity. The transatlantic European slavery uh, had 200,000 to 400,000 victims. I'm not talking only about the people who were transported, about 10 to 12 million to Abya Latin America, and the Americas, but I'm talking about the people who died, one up to five per person who arrived at the shores of Africa, West Africa. Five died on the way, and how many generations have been the victims of slavery in the Americas, Aviala? It lasted for 200 years. The indigenous Holocaust of Abyayala, where the indigenous people, the genocide there costed 50 to 75 million people within 150 years. The Victorian Holocaust, where the British engineered famine in India, costed 30 million to 60 million people. The Congolese Holocaust in Congo, where the Belgians cut off the hands of women and children in order to force the men to collect rubber, 10 out of 20 million were killed. So compare this to colonialism, to fascism, you'll see the human cost of colonialism outweighs fascism. Now, to understand the way in the memory of people fascism seems to be worse than colonialism, you have to understand what happened with the Potsdam Agreement after World War II between the Allied powers, where they had an article which says that German education will be organized in such a way that it will completely eliminate Nazi and militarist doctrines and will imbue everyone with democratic ideas. That's called denazification. That was the term they were used. And General McClure, Robert Alexis McClure, for Information Control Department of the US Army, he was in charge of it, and he says we will maintain full control of all newspapers, theaters, radio stations, and other media in Germany. So denazification went there in three stages. One is the reorientation of the German population, meaning a complete cessation of all media, and then the gradual reopening of some media, radio, newspapers under American control, and thirdly, gradual transfers of these media through licenses to carefully selected Germans. So here you see the difference between Hitler and Churchill. Churchill, Roosevelt promoted the idea that fascism was worse than colonialism, so they were the good guys and Hitler were the bad guys. And because we never had a process of decolonization of the mind, we still think that's the case. And therefore, we think that there's an essential difference between extreme right and the so-called moderate right or social democratic left. Now, extremism, that's my argument, extremism is not only from the extreme right, it's also from the moderate right and even the left. Support for Zionist occupation and genocide in Palestine is extreme. Support for the war in Ukraine imposed on Russia by NATO is extreme. And all these extreme measures, are carried out by moderate right and by the left. In US, it's Biden taking the leadership in it. So they might be in favor of more rights for people of color, but they're extreme in their efforts towards war. We are now at the end of the hegemony of 500 years of European civilization. So you get two extreme reactions. One is of the moderate right and the left, which is war, war, war. And the other is from the far right, the extreme right, which is basically isolationism and the emphasis on preserving white civilization. So the far right now is not the same as fascism in the 30s. Fascism in the 30s was about war, war, war. Far right now is about isolationism and a defense of white civilization, but not war, war, war. Extreme right is in fact against war. If you see how they have mobilized against the war in Ukraine, uh, uh, it is not a war party. They do support the genocide of the Zionists in Gaza, but they're not in favor of war with North Korea, or China, or Russia. And that's important to remember. So, what is our DTM answer to the to extremism, which is from the extreme right and from the moderate right and even the left? In my view, there are two central issues globally and locally. One is the emphasis on peace, peace, peace. We should enter into coalition of the global north and the global south on this theme. And then the central attention to the mechanisms of the colonization of the mind, because that is how the people are prepared to support war. And the alternative is that we should articulate a vision for a new world civilization, which is not universal as the old colonial one, but pluriversal, drawing from civilizations that have been there for thousands of years, and translate that vision into concrete action. I'll give a few examples of concrete action. We need an education campaign about the war in Ukraine and its connection with the genocide in Palestine and the coming war with China. So the focus on war education, the Ukraine war started by NATO in 2014. That educational campaign should go hand in hand with a project to have people-to-people dialogue. Talk to your enemy to achieve peace. Bring pro-Putin Russians to Amsterdam, Paris, London, and talk to them. Let them give their views. And this is in contrast to the extremist policy of a strategic military defeat of Russia. So, but if you do that, mind you that the colonization of the mind will going to be worked, because you will be criminalized as somebody is paid by Putin. Another example, we need to decolonize the 8 o'clock news. Why not set up an alternative for the 8 o'clock news where you just answer the lies of every day that they produce in colonizing the mind? Some journalists or students should be able to do this. And then we need to go into fundamental discussions about decolonizing knowledge production. Let's take, for example, economic theory. If we talk from economic theory, what would we suppose? We would propose, for example, dissolve NATO, dissolve the defense industry and the armies, put the money into free childcare, free education, free public transport, free medical care, cheap housing. We should have an economic policy based on peace, not on war. So, the whole DTM framework, you could read in the book, you could look at the podcast, you could look at sandahira.com to get an idea. And if you want to support the channel, subscribe to it, share it with friends, families, and colleagues, and encourage them to subscribe. Get involved in the discussion group, and if you want to make a donation, go to sandahira.com to see how you can do it. Thank you very much, and hope to see you next week.